Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining me. Hope you had an amazing week as usual. Now I'm continuing my wheel build tutorial, my super in-depth one. You may have seen my hour-and-a-half long video on how to lace a wheel. If you have, thanks for watching it. I really hope you've ended up with a nicely laced wheel no matter what pattern you chose. At the end of the last video, I ended up with a fully laced wheel, and I guess today we need to finish this thing off. We need to add some tension, make sure it's true in both side to side and up and down, and stress it. And I can't stress enough, how important it is to pre-stress a wheel if you want it to last. So today, that's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to run you through some of the hints and tips that I do when I build wheels to make sure they last as long as possible. Now I've had plenty of practice building wheels over the last 10 or so years, and actually this last week I've built 50 wheels for a fairly well-known bike company, so yeah, I've picked up a few hints and tips that I really think can help everyone. Now there will be loads of tips that I won't be covering because either I don't know them, or I will have forgotten them, or I just don't think they're that important, but the tips I will show you I think are the main ones, and if you use these you will end up with a very strong wheel. So if you do have some hints and tips you want to share with us that I don't share, please let me know down in the comments. If you do like this video, give me a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell button. It really does help with the video algorithms and get my videos shown, which really helps my channel. And one last thing before we get started, I just want to say a huge thank you to Light Bicycle for supplying me with their carbon rims. I've yet to break one of these and can highly recommend them. Also to Industry 9 for their Hydra hubs. This will be the first time ever using one of the Hydra hubs, and I can't wait. 600 engagement points, over 600. Anyway, let's get started. And to kick off, I'm going to run through some of the tools that I use, that I recommend, and will make life a lot easier when building a wheel. So let's get into it. So I guess I'll start with the most obvious bit of equipment, a wheel truing stand. Now I don't consider a wheel truing stand absolutely vital, however they do make life a lot easier. If you see yourself building more wheels in the future, then it's definitely a worthy investment to get a pretty decent wheel truing stand. I've been using this Park Tools TS2 for over 10 years now, and it's been pretty faultless, although one of the handles has actually snapped off. I fixed that with a bolt inside and I just use an Allen key to tighten it. Not the end of the world. There are other brands available, so if you see one you like, then try it out. This is the only wheel truing stand I've ever used, so I can't comment on other models. I'm sure there are some pretty decent ones out there, but these are quite expensive, but considering it's only had one thing that's broken in 10 years, I consider that pretty reliable. One thing that's good about it is quite heavy, and actually having a bit of heft to it makes it a lot nicer when you're spinning a wheel. It doesn't wobble all over the place. You can get ones that bolt to desks or go into vices, and those would be pretty decent as well. Getting a lightweight version is certainly a viable option if you don't have too much money to spend, or you're thinking of traveling with it to events. Having something a little lighter than this will certainly make life easier out on the road. One thing you may notice is I only have one truing arm. Now these actually as standard come with two, so you're on either side of the rim. Personally, I only like to use one arm, and I'll explain why later. One disadvantage to this stand in my setup is that I don't have any adapters to run through actual hubs. I think you can get adapters, so maybe I should invest, but one thing you can do to get around it is just buy something like this off eBay. This is literally a threaded bar with a couple of washers and cone spacers. This allows me to put this through any through axle hub, front or rear, and with that fitted, I can now fit that to my wheel truing stand. Now if you don't have a wheel truing stand, it is perfectly possible to just true a wheel on your frame. By adding a zip tie to the frame or the fork and cutting it to length, you can then use the zip tie as a guide to help true the wheel. And I'll tell you what, that's not bad for a wheel I've not touched in 2 years. So it's perfectly possible to completely build a wheel without a wheel truing stand by using the zip tie method on the frame or fork. But if you do see yourself building a few wheels in the future, then yeah, it's definitely worth getting a fairly decent wheel truing stand. But anyway, I think that's enough about the wheel truing stand. What other tools are we going to use? In my lacing video, I didn't actually use a spoke key. But now we're actually going to be truing the wheel properly. A spoke key is absolutely vital. Now my favorite brand is by Spoke Key. And these are the workshop models which have a double thickness insert, which makes it a lot harder to round off the nipple. Now these are just my personal preference. You may have one that you really like, but I actually really like these because they're made out of plastic. They have a little bit of flex to them, which makes life a little bit easier on the fingers. When building a lot of wheels, you can get fatigued in the fingers quite quickly, so having a bit of give makes life a little bit easier on the hands. And also I find having a little bit of give means it's a little less stressful on the nipples. Now you do get different gauges of nipples, which means you do get different size spoke keys. I use a 3.4mm spoke key, and this fits most generic nipples. Now this is a tool that I used in my wheel lacing video, and it's still going to be pretty handy to have one now as well. This is a nipple driver, and it's essentially just a modified screwdriver. So these aren't vital, you can just use a screwdriver, and some people even use an electric screwdriver, but having a nipple driver or screwdriver just make lacing and building the wheel a lot quicker. Next up is something I consider to be pretty vital, and that is some lube. Now there's loads of different ways you can lube the spoke threads and nipples. Some people will grease them before they even lace the wheel, but personally I like to add a little bit of oil at this stage of the wheel build. In my previous wheel build videos, my most asked question was, what lube do I use? Now actually I don't think it really matters. Any lube is better than no lube, and I usually just use whatever chain lube I can find. The more important thing to me is the actual applicator itself. Now this is just a completely random one I found on Amazon, but it's absolutely fantastic because it's got a really fine nozzle, which means I can get the lube exactly where I want it and not covering the rest of the rim or the spokes. This is refillable, and if you do want to know exactly what lube I'm using, I'm actually using some well-tight dry wax, which I just so happen to have. And yeah, like I said, I think any lube is better than no lube. If you've got some chain lube, it'll probably be pretty decent. The last tool I'm going to show you is a spoke tension gauge. This is a Park Tools one, and it basically allows you to make sure you've got exactly the same tension on all the spokes. Now I don't actually use this to make sure I'm at the right tension, I just use this to make sure that all the spokes are roughly the same. No matter how well made spokes, nipples, rims, hubs are, there's going to be some variables, so sometimes you can end up with some spokes that aren't as tight as others. And it's really important when building a wheel that you have pretty even tension on all the spokes, so having one of these will allow you to make sure that you have that. But these aren't vital. There are other ways to make sure you've got even tension, so I'd only really recommend getting one of these if you're going to be a serious builder building a lot of wheels. So there you go guys, that is just a quick rundown of some of the tools I would recommend using if you're going to be building some serious wheels. Let's get on to adding some tension, stressing the wheel and finishing it off. When it comes to putting the wheel in the wheel trim stand, it doesn't really matter which side you start on. And this is one reason why I like to go for the single truing arm. To find the correct dish, I'm actually going to be swapping the wheel around as we go. And by swapping the wheel around and using a single truing arm, we can quite easily get the wheel dished exactly in the center. I'd say most people do use 2 truing arms. That's what most wheel truing stands actually come with. If you do that, then that's absolutely fine, nothing wrong with it. This is just the way I like to build wheels. If I have 2 truing arms on here, then I'm just relying on the wheel truing stand being made correctly, getting it exactly in the center dish. Also, if your wheel is wobbling all over the place at the start, like they will be doing, if you've got 2 truing arms, then it's going to be hitting one side, then hitting the other side, hitting one side, and it's just not ideal. By having just one side, I can just concentrate on that side. I don't have any distractions on the other side, so yeah, this is why I prefer just having one truing arm. The first thing I do once the wheel is in the stand is I lube the spoke threads and nipples. This is where having an oil with a really accurate applicator comes in super handy. Now I always start at the valve because then it's just obvious when you've done a full lap of the wheel. Now at this point you want to have some threads showing on the nipples. You don't want them all run all the way up. By having some thread showing and just applying just a tiny drop of oil onto that thread, the oil will actually be sucked into the nipple with capillary action. This is just a super accurate way of getting the oil exactly where you need it to be, and you don't get any on the rim or wherever you don't want it to be. So just a small drop of oil on every single spoke, and by the time you get around to the end you'll find that this oil has been sucked exactly where it needs to be, like that. To make extra sure the oil has got where I want it to be, I just give the wheel a bit of a spin. So you should find you've got the spokes and the nipples nicely lubed and you haven't got any where you don't want it to be. Perfect. Once you've got all the spokes lubed, it's time to try and get everything on a level playing field. The way I build wheels is I do exactly the same number of turns on every single spoke. Now the only way that will work is if the spokes are starting at the same point. Now this method isn't 100% accurate, but it's pretty damn close and has worked well for me over the last 10 or so years. Essentially the plan is we start again at the valve just to make sure we know when we've done a full lap. We get the nipple driver or screwdriver or electric drill, whatever you're using. We find the nipple and we essentially turn the nipple until there's no threads showing anymore. And if we do that with all the nipples and all the spokes, then they should be all set at exactly the same point. So hopefully you can see we've got some threads showing there. We essentially just turn the nipple until there's no threads showing. And if we repeat that process with all the spokes and all the nipples, then that should be setting them all to exactly the same starting point. At this point, I often find it quite handy to try and straighten the spoke with one of my fingers or thumbs, just to make it easier to turn. So this spoke here is actually bowing out towards the camera a little bit, so I'll actually use my thumb to straighten it out, and then that will make it a lot easier to turn the nipple. And then yeah, just a case of repeating the process until all the nipples are done up to the ends of the threads. And this is why it's super handy to have some kind of nipple driver or electric screwdriver, just something that allows you to do this a little bit quicker. So once you've done the nipples all up to the end of the threads, that gives a good starting point for when we do an equal number of turns the entire wheel. We're always going to have to do slightly different turns anyway, because we need to true the wheel. No wheel is ever really perfect. So just by having the spokes all run up to the threads, it gives a really good starting point. And you may even find that just by running the nipples up to the threads on the spokes, that your wheel is actually considerably straighter even at just the starting point. But there's still a little bit of way to go. We're not anywhere near finished yet, so the next point is we need to start adding a lot more tension to these spokes. This is where having a spoke key is pretty vital, and having one that fits your nipples is going to make life a lot easier and stop you from rounding them off. And now it's simply a case of adding exactly the same number of turns on the spokes until we've done a full lap of the wheel. How many turns you do now is entirely up to you. It might be really tempting when the spokes are nice and baggy like this just to go and do like 10 turns on the first spoke, but as soon as you get halfway around the wheel, you'll find they start to get super tight, and that's just far too many to start with. So I would say start with at least one full turn and do that entire way around the wheel. It's more than likely you need to do more than one full turn if you've got the correct length spokes, but we can always add the extra turns later. So that's one turn on the first, one on the second, and the third. And we just repeat this until we've gone all the way around the wheel. Don't worry if you have one that's slightly tighter than the other, or maybe one's looser. Just do exactly the same number of turns at this point. It can be really tempting at this point to have one spoke that's really quite loose compared with some of the others and just really add a lot of tension to that one, but yeah, you don't want to do that. It might be that that spoke is a lot straighter than the other spokes, maybe the other spokes are a little bit more bent. There's just going to be different reasons why some spokes will be tighter than others, but at this point it's really important just to do an equal number of turns the entire way around. Now, as I was going around then, I could tell that one turn wasn't going to be enough, and I think I'm going to need at least one more full turn, maybe 3. So I'm going to go around, add one more full turn and see how it feels after that. So now I've gone around the wheel and I've added 2 turns to every single spoke. Now they did feel all fairly even tension, apart from those 2, these ones here, they actually feel a little bit loose. Now, like I said, I'm just going to leave that for now. If that's still loose later on, then I'll fix it then, but at this point, early in the wheel build, I'm just going to leave all the spokes exactly the same number of turns. So if you do find one that's extra loose, don't worry about it just yet. Now, how much tension you add at this very first stage is up to you. I actually like to add a fair amount of tension, because what we're going to do after this is get it fairly straight, but then we're going to stress it. And the more tension it has now, the more effective the stressing is going to be. At this stage, the tension isn't quite high enough, so I'm going to do at least one more full turn on all the spokes once again. So there we go, that is an extra turn done on all the spokes, and the tension is starting to get quite high now. So that's quite a good starting point. But before we stress it, I'm actually going to try and get this wheel fairly straight. The straighter we get this now, the less work we have once we stress the wheel. Now, you don't have to get the wheel absolutely perfect, but getting it somewhere close is definitely worthwhile. Before I do start truing the wheel, I need to decide how dished it is, whether it needs to go to one way or the other. And to do that, I get it so it's just touching on the rim, like that. And then I'll actually swap the wheel over to the other side. So it's now rubbing a lot more, which means the wheel needs to go over to the other side. So I'm going to leave the wheel on this side and true the wheel from this side first. I'm going to concentrate on side-to-side trueness first. So to do this, I just give the wheel a bit of a spin and I'll adjust the truing arm in until it just starts touching the rim. So now that is rubbing this truing arm, I know the wheel needs to go over that way. Now there's two ways you can do this. You can either loosen the spokes on this side of the rim or tighten the spokes on that side of the rim, or a combination of the two. So I normally find the point where it just starts to rub, which is there. Then I'm actually going to tighten the spokes on the other side about a quarter of a turn. You actually want to spread this over a slightly large area. You don't want to do this with just a single spoke, you want to do it with at least a couple, ideally 3, or basically the more you do, the better. So that also rubs here. So it starts rubbing there, so I'm going to start with this spoke, give that about a quarter of a tighten on the second one, and that no longer rubs. There's still a long way for it to go, so again I adjust the arm in, and it's rubbing there, just a slight tighten on the opposite side spokes. Now there is another way to do this. If you don't want the wheel to always be pulled over that way, you can actually look to see where there's a big gap. So at this point there's a large gap between my truing arm and the rim, so if I want it to go this way, I tighten the spokes on this side of the rim, like that. Now these spokes are actually the two spokes that I mentioned earlier that felt a little bit loose. So that correlates to the wheel actually being over that way because these two spokes are tighter than these two, pulling the wheel over that side. So at this point I'm actually going to tighten these two until this gap down at the truing arm is slightly smaller. And rather than just do those two, I'm just going to spread that over a larger area. And I'm actually going to do this until they all feel roughly the same hardness to turn. So that's the wheel getting a little bit closer now. So these wheels do actually have a sticker which can catch on a truing arm once you start to get accurate, but at this point it doesn't really matter too much. I'm just getting it pretty close but not perfect. It is hitting the sticker, but it's actually hitting the rim just before the sticker, so I know it still needs to go over to the side a little bit. So tighten those. Got still a little bit of a hit there. Going to pull the wheel over this way slightly. One thing I sometimes do once I start to get quite accurate is I'll actually flex the wheel over at points where I think it's going to rub, just kind of enhance the buckle a little bit. So at this point it's not quite touching the rim, but if I just flex the wheel over slightly, I can make it rub. So I know at this point I need to tighten these two spokes just a tiny amount to pull that wheel over. So that's as straight as this needs to be now. It's not perfect, but we'll fix that later. We're going to stress the spokes. This is going to go out of true quite a bit in a moment, but for now that's pretty good. But one thing I need to do is check the dish, make sure that the rim is in the middle. So I'm going to flip the wheel over, make sure that is sitting in there nice and central. Now if I look down at the truing arm, there's actually a big gap there now, so I know the wheel needs to come over to this side just a little bit. So what I do now is I put this truing arm in halfway, and I now need to make this rim pretty much touch this truing arm, and I know that that will be perfectly dished. So to do this, I'm just going to do half a turn on each spoke on this side. So it's getting closer. Just to double check this, I'll flip the wheel over again and double check. So at this point I know the wheel does need to go over to that side slightly, so at any point where the wheel's touching I'm just tightening the spokes on that side. Now that I know the wheel is pretty well dished and the side to side trueness is pretty good as well, I need to work on the up and down trueness, or the egg of the wheel. Now a lot of people may struggle with the egg, but it's actually pretty much exactly the same as a side to side trueness except done vertically. In this instance I'm now going to put the truing arm underneath the rim, give it a spin, and again wherever it hits there we need to tighten these spokes to pull the rim up. Wherever there's a big gap like there we can loosen the spokes and the rim will go down. So it's exactly the same as side to side except flipped vertically. So I'm going to start on that now. So at any point the rim touches the truing arm, I'm going to tighten these spokes. Now how much you tighten them depends on how much it's hitting. At this point it's not hitting very much, so I'm just going to do maybe not even quarter of a turn on those ones, and that's fixed that bit. So now there's one big bit here where it's hitting the truing arm, so I'm going to do a combination of tightening these, maybe about a quarter of a turn, just slightly less than quarter of a turn. I'd be surprised if this gets rid of it, but we're not trying to get rid of it all. So now it just touches there, but instead of getting that bit, I'm actually going to look down visually and see where the biggest gap is between the rim and the truing arm, which is about there. And I'm actually going to loosen these spokes off just a little bit. And again, I'm working over a fairly large area of the rim. You don't want to do this on just a couple of spokes, but by loosening these spokes, the wheel should drop down ever so slightly. So now I've reduced the gaps a little bit, I'm actually going to put the truing arm just up a little bit. And again, we've got two bits that hit. So we've got this bit here, which I'm going to start there, and again, not even quarter of a turn on the spokes, just a little turn each over a large area. And now again, we've only got one bit that hits, starting about there to about there. So I'm going to start on this one, and again, just small adjustments. You don't want to go nuts and work over a large area. And then after a few simple adjustments, I've now made the wheel a lot truer up and down. However, that has made the wheel slightly out of true side to side, so now I just need to fix that just a little bit. Now this rim does have stickers on, which means every time those stickers go around, it's going to catch, which does make it slightly harder to get the wheel perfectly true, but that's close enough for now. And now we need to stress the wheel. Stressing the wheel is the most important thing you're going to do to make your wheel last a long time. If you ever unbuilt a wheel, you'll look at the hub and you'll see there's loads of indentations where the spokes have been into the hub. So by stressing the wheel, we're wanting to actually put those indentations into the hub now, rather than waiting for that to happen through riding, and that's when your spokes will come loose. A lot of people think that spokes stretch while riding, and that's why spokes come loose. But nah, spokes don't really stretch. If they did, there'd be a rubbish choice for a stiff wheel. Essentially what happens is the spokes being hard steel and the aluminium being soft, they actually dig into the aluminium and create little pockets. So those pockets give space for the spokes to come loose, and that's why your spokes do become loose. It's not because the spokes are stretching, so it's really important to stress the wheel as much as possible now. The more you stress the wheel, the less likely it is your spokes will come loose further down the road. Now there's a few different ways you can stress a wheel, but there's one way I think is best. Now you may see people try and flex the wheel with their elbows like that, or they might push it against the floor or the side of a desk or something and put their weight into it. Some people might even just try and squeeze the spokes together. And some of those methods might actually work for you, especially if you've got a pretty lightweight flexy rim that you can actually flex and bend. But I suspect you're not actually stressing the wheel as much as you could be by doing that technique. Or maybe you're using the wheels for something like road riding, where you're not putting too much force through them, so they don't actually end up denting the spokes all that much through riding use. But the technique I use, which you may have seen in my previous wheel build video, is quite extreme, but believe me, it works so well, especially for some heavy duty wheels like I use for trials. So if you've seen this before, you know what's coming. If you haven't, this may be a little bit of a shock, but essentially, if you put your wheel on the floor, ideally on something padded like a bit of carpet or cardboard or a mat like I've got here, then essentially we're going to put all of our weight onto the spokes. And when I say all of my weight, I mean all of it, and then jump as well. Now it may seem quite dramatic, but if you've got a nice stiff wheel like this, you'd be surprised how much weight they can take. I would still do this technique on a lightweight wheel, but I would take it slightly easier. Obviously, a lighter weight rim might not be able to take this much abuse, and some hub flanges can be pretty lightweight as well, so just be sensible with it. But in this case, I can pretty much go nuts with this. I weigh 74 kilos, and I'm jumping at least twice on every spoke crossing. Once that's done, flip the wheel over and we do the other side. So there we go, that's the wheel stamped twice on each crossing on each side. And that's actually now loosened off the spokes just a little bit because it's now dented the hub flange. So that is my preferred method on how to stress a wheel. By stamping on the spokes, I'm probably putting more stress than I'll ever put in through riding. The hub flanges are now dented as much as they'll ever be, and my spokes shouldn't ever come loose. It may look extreme, but I do this with all my wheels, all the wheels I build for other people, even lightweight cross-country wheels, but like I said, you have to be a little bit careful with that, and I've never had any issues. But there are a couple of extra things you can do just to make things a little bit easier. This is technically stressing, but we're not actually denting the flange anymore. Because the spokes cross over each other, there's actually going to be a slight bend in the spoke, and the tighter that bend will be, the less chance that that bend will become tighter over time and then have a loose spoke as a result. Like I said, there's two ways we're going to do this. The first involves a rubber mallet. Now where the spokes actually exit the hub, they have a slight bend there as well. So essentially, by hitting those, we're going to make that bend as flat as possible, making as straight as line as possible to the rim. And now I should have a much better angle of the spoke coming out of the hub towards the rim. Now the second technique involves a different tool. I'm just going to use an adjustable spanner here, but you want something ideally that has a little bit of padding on it so that we don't scratch the spokes. Now what we're essentially going to do is get the tool you've chosen, put it in between the spokes where they cross, and flex the spokes together. Flexing the spokes together like this will just make the bend where they cross just a little bit better. Once that's done, swap around to the other side and repeat. So that's actually just given a very subtle change in how the spokes are angled. You probably won't be able to pick that up on camera, but now the spokes are actually bent in a much more efficient manner. So the next thing to do is stick this back in a wheel truing stand, tighten up the spokes because we've just lost some tension from stressing the wheel, and get this to its final tension and final trueness. Normally after stressing a wheel, it gives about a 1 full turn of extra tension you can add to each spoke. So I'm going to go around now and just add 1 turn to every spoke. Now ideally, they should all be at a fairly even tension at this point, but you may still find that 1 or 2 are a little bit tighter or a little bit slacker, but that's okay, it's not the end of the world. We can fix that at this next point. But so far, these are all feeling pretty even. You may find that they actually get a little bit tighter as you go around the rim. The last 2 may be a little bit on the tight side, but that's perfectly normal. And sometimes you may even find that one feels really loose, but when you come to check it with the spoke tension meter, it actually is the same as everything else. Sometimes just some nipples or the threads are a little bit cleaner and just have less frictions. And that's why I always say do the same number of turns, because sometimes you just don't know why one is tighter. It could just be that it has better threads. So there we go, that is 1 turn done on every spoke, and that is pretty much going to be my final tension. I don't feel I need to add any more tension to those. They feel pretty spot on. What isn't spot on is now the trueness, so it's certainly gone out of true side to side. It actually does have a slight bit of up and down, but not very much at all. I won't have to do very much to fix that at all. But now I just need to make sure the trueness is good. Before I really start work on the trueness, again, I'm just going to make sure the dish is good, so it is slightly rubbing. If I swap the wheel over, it's now rubbing quite a lot. So I'm going to leave the wheel this way around and start on this side, truing the wheel over to my left. And because this is the final tension I'm going to be working with, I don't really want to add too much more. So I'm going to be both working on slightly tightening some spokes, but also loosening some of the others to make sure I can get the wheel over where I want it. And again, like I mentioned, having stickers on the rim will make this slightly harder. If you have the option of adding stickers later, I would recommend building the wheel first and then adding the stickers. Now the wheel is pretty close to being true now, so rather than working in a big area, I'm just really nitpicking and finding just the smallest little bits that need to go, and now I'm just working on single spokes, but only turning them just a little bit. So that's the side-to-side trueness, pretty much perfect. So now I'm just going to work on the up and down trueness again. Rubs quite a bit just on this area here, so I'm just going to slightly tighten these spokes. If you go down the route of always tightening the spokes rather than loosening some to true the wheel, then when it comes to trying to true it up and downness, you may find that some spokes just become too tight to even turn. So you always want to have some leeway. Don't always go for tighter is better, because you may run out of tightness at some point. That's the up and down trueness or egging fix. Now that is sorted. So because I've turned some of the spokes, the side to side trueness has gone out ever so slightly, so just need to fix that, and that will be the wheel almost done. So there we go, that is the wheel up and down true and side to side true. All the spoke tension is tight and up where I want it to be. There's only one thing we need to do now, and that is do a final stress on the wheel. Now this isn't to dent the hub, we've already done that, but what we have done is, as we tighten the spokes, we've actually twisted them ever so slightly. So now we need to try and flex the wheel the best we can and undo that twist. If you ever get on a bike that has a new wheel, you may notice it makes a lot of pinging noises for a very short while when you first get on it. That is all the spokes essentially untwisting. So we're going to sort that out now, because that untwisting spokes, it's not going to affect the wheel too much, but it may put it out of true ever so slightly. So by stressing the wheel now and untwisting the spokes, it makes it as good as it can be. Now getting the twist out of the spokes on a super stiff rim like this can be pretty hard, because I'm pretty much going to do some of the stressing techniques I showed you earlier. The one I normally choose is to put the wheel in my stomach and try and push down with my elbows while pulling up with my hands. So like, and there we go, click there, a slight click there, no click, no click, a slight click. And if you sit down into it, you can really get some power into this. So I think this is quite a good way of stressing a wheel if you don't want to stamp on it, but stamping a wheel is better. Just this works pretty well for untwisting the spokes. Once you've done one side, flip it over, do the other side. Couldn't get any clicks out of that side, so I'm happy with that. Just going to stick it in the stand again and do a final check. So that stressing put the wheel out of true ever so slightly, but now that the wheel is fully stressed and the spokes are pretty much all unwound, that should stay nice and straight. That's just hitting one of the stickers now, so I'm happy with that. That is the final wheel. The only thing we need to do now is check that all the spoke tensions are equal. Now I would actually be pretty happy to ride this wheel without checking any spoke tensions. From feel alone, I can tell that they're pretty much all the same. But for this video, I'm going to check anyway and see how we've done. Now obviously, like I mentioned, I'm going to use my Park Tools spoke tension gauge, but if you don't have one of these, what can you do? If you grab something hard like an Allen key, then you can just tap the spokes and go from ear. This is like tuning a piano or an instrument, and you basically want them to sound all as close as possible to each other. There are some ever so slight differences there, but they're pretty much all exactly the same tone, which is exactly where we want to be. It would be really noticeable if you hit one that's a vastly different note to anything else. That's when you need to sort it, but in this case, that's close enough. That's all it needs to be. Because of tolerances in hubs, rims, spokes, nipples, threads, you're never going to be exactly the same tension. There's going to be some slight differences, so don't worry if there's ever so slight differences in tones. As long as they're close enough, you're all good. Now if you want to go full detailed, then using a spoke tension meter is the way to go. Like I said, I don't use one of these to make sure my tension is good. I know my tension is good. I just use one of these to make sure that all the tensions are equal. There's going to be some differences between the spokes, but as long as they're within a range of, I don't know, maybe up to 4 points on here, then I'm happy enough. So there we go everyone, that is my final wheel. I'm happy that this is dished directly in the middle. I'm happy with the spoke tension. I'm happy all the nipples are lubed. So I now have a fully finished wheel. Happy days. And that wasn't a moment too soon, because it's actually starting to get a bit dark and my lighting in my wheel truing area isn't that great at the minute. Can't wait to get this wheel fitted to my bike and get those 600 plus engagement points to good use. I really hope my previous lacing video has allowed you to get a nicely laced wheel, and I really hope this video has allowed you to get a nicely finished wheel. Let me know down in comments if this helped you. Let me know if you've heard these tips before. Let me know if you have any other tips that maybe I don't even know about. I'd love to hear them. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already and hit that notification button. I have videos released earlier on Patreon, and I do have a PayPal account if you did want to help out with a donation towards this channel, allow me to make more videos like this. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have many years riding your newly built wheel, and I'll catch you next time. So take care everyone. Bye bye.